The air in Harlem had always been thick, a heavy mixture of exhaust fumes, frying grease, cheap cologne, and the pervasive, underlying scent of ambition mixed with desperation. But on this particular Tuesday night, the usual symphony of urban struggle and clandestine enterprise was replaced by a chilling, unnatural silence inside the brownstone on 114th Street. This residence, deceptively quiet and meticulously maintained, was the unofficial sanctum of Frank Lucas, a man who, despite his humble appearance and studied calm, controlled the very pulse and poison of the city's underworld. This night, however, that sanctum had been brutally defiled, and the silence was merely the terrifying prelude to a storm of biblical proportion. It began not with a bang, but with a choked whimper. Frank Lucas was not present when the violation occurred, but the aftermath spoke a language of senseless, targeted destruction that surpassed any mere criminal rivalry. He arrived moments after the perpetrators had vanished, slipping through the polished doorframe and immediately freezing on the threshold. The scene inside defied comprehension. This was not a robbery. Nothing of value had been taken, save for the incalculable currency of peace and security. This was a statement, crudely executed and saturated with malice. His wife, Juliana, lay on the imported Persian rug, her face bruised and swelling, struck repeatedly, but deliberately kept alive. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the ceiling, cataloguing horrors Lucas could only begin to imagine. His youngest child was huddled beneath a shattered antique mahogany table, weeping silently, their small body convulsing with a fear deeper than any physical pain. The specific, calculated nature of the attack was instantly apparent. Furniture slashed, not overturned, walls spray-painted, not ransacked, and the words, the grotesque, hateful symbols left smeared across the imported silk wallpaper, symbols historically intended to terrorize and dehumanize. These were the true wounds, inflicted not just upon his family, but upon the very foundation of his life's edifice. For years, Frank Lucas had walked a tightrope, balancing unimaginable wealth against the constant threat of rival gangs, the relentless pressure of the federal government, and the inherent instability of the drug trade. He was a meticulous operator, a ghost in a business of loudmouth, and his cardinal rule, the unwavering cornerstone of his highly profitable reign, was the absolute isolation and inviolability of his domestic life. To touch his family was to breach the final, sacred covenant of the street. Whoever had done this had committed an act of professional suicide, layered atop an act of sheer, unfettered prejudice. Lucas, usually the picture of tailored restraint, felt a cold, seismic shift within him, a geological force moving from the pit of his stomach up through his chest, freezing the blood in his veins before boiling it anew. He looked at the chaos, at the unmistakable signature of racial animosity, and understood immediately. These were not street rivals seeking territory or retribution. These were ideological invaders, white supremacists driven by a venomous cocktail of ignorance, hate, and a staggering miscalculation of whose domain they had just dared to profane. The ensuing silence Lucas maintained, bending low over his wife, was more terrifying than any scream, a promise of absolute, unsparing retribution already sealed in the silent, empty night. Harlem in the early 1970s was a mosaic of burgeoning black power, deep-seated poverty, and unparalleled hustle. It was a self-governing ecosystem, one where the official law often treaded lightly or operated entirely on the payroll of the unofficial governing bodies. At the peak of this shadowy hierarchy sat Frank Lucas. His operation, built on the revolutionary concept of flying heroin, the infamous blue magic, directly from Southeast Asia, bypassing the traditional Italian pipeline, had made him wealthy beyond the dreams of kings and untouchable by the established criminal order. He moved in tailored suits and quiet Cadillac, a phantom of fiscal efficiency. He maintained a semblance of respectability, paying off the right people, managing his lieutenants with military precision, and crucially, avoiding the kind of chaotic public violence that drew unwanted federal scrutiny. He believed in order. He had purchased not just wealth, but immunity, a fortress of money and influence designed to shield his loved ones from the brutal realities that sustained his power. The attackers, fueled by a corrosive blend of cheap liquor and cheaper ideologies, had not just attacked a family, they had committed an act of political terrorism against the established black criminal sovereignty of Harlem, mistaking Lucas's quiet, domestic front for vulnerability. They had violated the invisible lines drawn in the concrete, lines the NYPD and even the mafia knew better than to cross. The details began to emerge slowly, filtered through Juliana's halting, traumatized account and the raw fear of the housekeeper who had hidden in the pantry. A vehicle, described as a battered Ford, carrying 3 men. They were loud, arrogant, and overtly hostile, not disguised like common thieves. They wore cheap, mismatched clothes, but beneath the superficial grime, there was a frightening, almost uniformed aggression. They had targeted the house specifically because it represented affluent black success, a visual affront to their warped worldview. The housekeeper recounted their taunts, racial epithets spat with conviction, accusations of ill-gotten gains, and the terrifying casual brutality with which they handled the family members. They hadn't wanted money, they had wanted degradation. They had sought to inflict symbolic damage, to reassert a spectral, baseless authority in a territory where they held none. The men were clumsy, reckless, outsiders, operating with a sickening sense of ideological entitlement, the most dangerous kind of amateur. Lucas felt the profound, humiliating failure of his carefully constructed shield. All his power, all his wealth, had failed to stop 3 insignificant, hateful bigots from laying hands on his own. The medical response was handled privately, secretly, to avoid alerting the police, the very establishment Lucas deeply distrusted. Juliana had been struck repeatedly, but the lasting injury was the profound shock. The desecration of the home, the physical manifestation of the slurs scrawled in thick amateur paint, demanded an answer that transcended mere imprisonment. The hours that followed were an exercise in controlled, predatory efficiency. Lucas did not weep, shout, or break things. His rage was crystalline, channeled instantly into command and coordination. He summoned his primary lieutenants, men hardened by years of street warfare and the brutal discipline of his organization. Zachary, his most trusted enforcer and strategist, and Jimmy, his intelligence specialist. They entered the silent brownstone, saw the evidence of the hate crime, and understood instantly the gravity of the mission. This was not a drug retrieval or a debt collection. This was war, waged in defense of the Crown's honor. Lucas, standing amid the wreckage of his dining room, spoke only in hushed, lethal commands. They are not common criminals. They left their mark. They are looking to assert something they believe they deserve. Find the marking, find the type of paint, find the car, find the pattern. If they felt comfortable coming here, they feel comfortable somewhere else nearby. They are loud. They are stupid. Stupidity leaves traces. The machinery of the Blue Magic Empire, usually dedicated to moving kilos of high-purity heroin across continents, was instantly diverted to the single task of hunting 3 anonymous racist thugs. Intelligence networks that spanned from the docks of Jersey to the precinct houses of the Bronx were activated. Lucas wasn't seeking informants. He was demanding surveillance, atmosphere, and instant access to any reported incident of racial violence or vehicle matching the description provided. Lucas, normally averse to firearms, spent an unusual 15 minutes in his secured study, meticulously cleaning and loading a heavy customized revolver, a ritualistic preparation that signaled a fundamental shift from businessman to executioner. His men watched, understanding that they were about to participate in an unprecedented act of private justice. Lucas's instructions were chillingly simple. I want them alive when they are brought to me. I need them to understand why this is happening, and I need their apprehension to be silent. No public disturbance, no police report. This stays invisible until the moment it becomes absolutely undeniable. The tension escalated when Jimmy, using contacts within the sanitation department, a network often exploited for discreet surveillance, returned with the first solid lead. The paint used on the walls was cheap, industrial-grade enamel, often stolen from construction sites or municipal maintenance depots. More importantly, the crude, hand-painted symbol left prominently on the shattered mirror frame, a specific archaic variant of a white supremacist insignia, was unique. It wasn't mainstream Klan, it was regional, tied to a small, known fringe group operating out of the distant periphery of the city. The group was connected to disgruntled union workers and low-level political operatives in Queens, territories Lucas rarely bothered to concern himself with. The fact that these men had traveled this far into Harlem, deep into his territory, spoke volumes about their blind arrogance and the profound sense of safety they must have felt in their own remote corners of the city. Lucas recognized the pattern. They were shielded by distance and by the assumption that the criminal establishment of Harlem would never risk exposing itself to deal with such peripheral vermin. Meanwhile, a parallel drama unfolded within the corridors of power. The initial 911 calls from Lucas's household, the frantic reports of masked figures spewing racial epithets and wielding chains, were buried instantly beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference and thinly veiled complicity. The handful of patrolmen who actually arrived did so slowly, maneuvering their vehicles with exaggerated caution, their faces a mixture of fear and disinterest. They recorded statements with mechanical detachment, their pens moving across the paper like spiders, collecting details they clearly intended to lose in the abyss of cold case file. The message was clear, delivered not through words, but through absence. This was a problem the established powers did not wish to solve. Solving it meant acknowledging that a hate group existed, operated brazenly in the heart of the city, and worse, that they had dared to challenge Frank Lucas. The white establishment, corrupt or simply terrified of upsetting the delicate racial and criminal balance, had silently, lethally, ceded the field to the man they normally hunted. This institutional surrender was the greatest insult, but also the greatest catalyst. Lucas did not need the law. He only needed the law to get out of the way, and they had. Lucas met with Detective Truman, one of the most compromised officers on his payroll, a man whose expensive lifestyle far exceeded his official salary. They met in a dimly lit, nondescript restaurant miles outside Harlem. Truman was pale, shaking, burdened by the double weight of official inaction and private terror. "Frank, listen to me," Truman whispered, glancing nervously at the empty tables. "They are scared. Not of you, not yet. They are scared of what they represent. If the brass opens an investigation, they have to admit these guys are connected to people much higher up the chain. We're talking politicians, city council donors, maybe even judges. It goes deep, Frank. Deeper than drugs, deeper than prostitution. This is about power structure." Truman confirmed the worst. Orders had come down from high above the precinct level. Handle quietly, no visibility, let the street cool itself off. It was the tacit permission Lucas needed. The police were not just stepping aside, they were actively creating a vacuum. "They want me to clean up their mess," Lucas mused, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "They want me to take out the trash so their white hands don't get dirty handling white trash." The search intensified, focusing on municipal records, union halls, and backwater bars in the outer boroughs. The police, still officially unaware of the scope of the violation, were actively ignoring petty racial incidents reported in distant parts of Queens. This neglect was Lucas's advantage. His network moved with an efficiency the NYPD could only dream of. Lucas poured resources into the effort, understanding that this expense was not an investment in profit, but an investment in sovereignty. They focused on specific details gleaned from the traumatized accounts, a particular tattoo seen briefly on an exposed forearm, the distinct scent of cheap plastic from the masks, and most tellingly, a silver signet ring depicting an obscure symbol associated with mid-level Klan recruitment in the Northeast. Lucas dispatched his people into the forgotten corners of Queens, areas where the economic anxieties of the white working class festered into racial resentment, places where men gathered in back rooms of dilapidated social clubs. Within 48 hours, Jimmy had secured the crucial information. The Ford, identified by a partial plate and a unique fender dent, had been tracked to a small, dilapidated social club in Ozone Park, Queens, a known, though minor hub for white nationalist sympathizers called the Heritage Corner. But this wasn't their true head. Further intelligence revealed that the cell's leadership, including the man identified as Billy Ray, a sanitation worker who moonlighted as a low-level union organizer, used a decommissioned warehouse near the Brooklyn docks for their more serious operations. This was where they stored weapons, held meetings, and most importantly, planned their attacks. Intelligence indicated a scheduled gathering at the warehouse in 3 days' time, a celebration of their successful raid on Harlem. The identification of Billy Ray brought a chilling understanding of their motivation. He was a man whose entire worldview was collapsing under the weight of changing demographics and the rise of black wealth, and he had sought to lash out at the most visible, high-stakes target he could find. Lucas understood the systemic nature of the hatred. This wasn't random. It was ideological warfare brought to his doorstep. Lucas was obsessive about the plan. This wasn't a simple retaliation. It was a statement that would reverberate through every level of the city's power structure. He assembled not just his usual soldiers, but hired professionals from the shadows of organized crime who understood the concept of complete operational silence. The target is the ideology, Zachary. The men are merely the delivery mechanism, Lucas instructed. This must be a response that makes their terror feel like a child's slap. When we are done, no one, not the city, not the police, not their distant cousins down south, will ever mistake my family for soft targets again. The acquisition of weapons was meticulous. Lucas didn't want the noise of automatic fire that would draw federal attention. He wanted decisive, clean, brutal power. Pump-action shotguns loaded with slugs, heavy-caliber revolvers, silenced rifles for perimeter control. This wasn't a shootout. It was an execution disguised as an earthquake. The plan was surgical, swift entry, absolute control, and a focus on minimizing noise while maximizing impact. The logistics involved diverting attention in the docklands, coordinating simultaneous power outages on specific blocks, and ensuring that any exit points were completely sealed. Lucas coordinated with corrupt utility workers, dock supervisors, and even harbor patrol officers, all on his payroll, to ensure the warehouse would be completely isolated. In the days leading up to the scheduled meeting, Lucas maintained his public face, the sharp suits, the expensive cigars, the quiet, concerned businessman. But beneath that veneer, he was a creature of singular, cold purpose. He looked at his wife and child, saw the residual fear in their eyes, the nervous flinches at sudden sounds, and the calculation hardened further. The night before the action, Lucas addressed his men in a safe house, far removed from the city's ears. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. These men were loyal, highly paid, and highly trained. They were Black, Italian, Puerto Rican, a coalition united by service to the Lucas organization. They came into our house, Lucas stated simply, his voice low, magnetic. They soiled the only thing we build that truly mattered, family. They came with masks and hate, believing they were untouchable because of the color of their skin and the symbols they wore. Tonight, we prove them wrong. We strip away their symbols, their masks, and their belief in immunity. When you leave that building, there will be nothing left but the consequences of their arrogance. As midnight approached, the overwhelming force began to move. Cars, inconspicuous vans, and trucks carrying heavily armed men converged silently toward the isolated Brooklyn docks. Lucas, sitting in the lead vehicle, watched the city lights recede, preparing to enter a landscape governed not by the statutes of New York State, but by the ancient, brutal law of eye for an eye. The warehouse sat in a forgotten industrial zone, surrounded by rusted shipping containers and abandoned machinery. A single dim light glowed from a second-floor window. The targets felt safe here, celebrating their act of terror, convinced they were protected by distance and the incompetence of Harlem's supposed criminal kingpin. The operation unfolded with military precision. The power grid for the entire block died exactly at 12:47 a.m. The perimeter team, already in position, cut all communication lines. The entry team, led by Zachary, breached the main door with a hydraulic ram so quickly that the first sound the occupants heard was boots on the concrete floor. Inside, 7 men sat around a makeshift table, drinking beer and laughing. Billy Ray was in the middle of a story about Juliana's terrified expression when the doors burst open. The laughter died instantly. Flashlights illuminated their shocked faces. They reached for weapons, baseball bats, a single handgun, but froze when they saw the overwhelming force arrayed against them. "Don't move," Zachary commanded, his voice flat and professional. "Hands on the table, now." The men complied, terror replacing their earlier bravado. Lucas entered last, walking slowly through the scattered beer cans and racist propaganda materials littering the floor. He studied each face, memorizing features, seeing past the cheap swagger to the pathetic cowardice beneath. He stopped in front of Billy Ray. "You made a mistake," Lucas said quietly. "You thought distance would protect you. You thought I was just some Naya drug dealer who wouldn't dare leave his territory. You thought wrong." Billy Ray tried to speak, to offer excuses or threats, but Lucas raised a hand for silence. "I'm not here for conversation. I'm here to teach a lesson that will echo through every racist hole in this city. You touched my family. You violated the one line no one crosses. And now you pay." What happened in that warehouse over the next hours was never officially recorded. The NYPD, true to their silent agreement, ignored the screams that neighbors later claimed to have heard. When the power returned at dawn, the warehouse appeared empty from the outside, but inside, the message was clear. Billy Ray and 2 of his lieutenants were found bound to chairs, alive but bearing the unmistakable marks of severe physical interrogation. Surrounding them were detailed confessions, written in their own hand under duress, outlining the entire structure of the organization, naming every police officer provided them protection, every politician who had turned a blind eye, and every business that had funded their activity. The other 4 men were never found. Their disappearance sent a message more powerful than any execution. Cross Frank Lucas, and you simply cease to exist. But Lucas's true genius was in what he did with the confessions. He didn't send them to the media. He sent them directly to the most ruthless internal affairs investigators in the NYPD, men who had been blocked from pursuing corruption cases by the very officials named in the document. He sent copies to federal prosecutors who had long suspected municipal corruption but lacked evidence. He weaponized the confessions, turning them into guided missiles aimed at the heart of the establishment that had enabled the attack on his family. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Within a week, 3 precinct captains were under investigation. Within a month, a deputy police commissioner had resigned. The scandal threatened to engulf the entire municipal power structure. The police union boss called an emergency secret meeting with Lucas 3 weeks after the warehouse incident. They met in a luxury hotel suite far from both Harlem and police headquarters. The union boss, a man whose influence rivaled that of elected officials, was sweating despite the air conditioning. "You've made your point," he said, his voice strained. "The men who attacked your family have been dealt with. The confessions have caused enough damage. We need this to stop." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You need it to stop because your entire corrupt system is being exposed. You need it to stop because the truth is more dangerous to you than I ever was. What do you want?" Lucas's answer was simple and absolute. "Immunity. Complete and total. My family, my operations, my territory, untouchable. Any officer who even looks at my house gets transferred. Any investigation into my business gets quietly shelved. You leave Harlem alone, and I'll stop sending evidence to the federal prosecutors." The union boss's face went pale. "You can't expect—" "I don't expect. I demand. You had your chance to do the right thing when my family was attacked. You chose to step aside. Now you'll step aside permanently, or I'll release everything I have on every dirty cop in this city. The FBI would love to see the full extent of your organization's corruption." The silence stretched for a full minute. Finally, the union boss nodded. "Agreed. But if you step out of line—" "I won't," Lucas interrupted. "I never wanted this war. You forced it on me when you let those animals attack my home. Now live with the consequences." The unofficial agreement held. Over the following months, any investigation that touched Frank Lucas's operations mysteriously stalled. Officers who showed too much interest in Harlem were reassigned. The NYPD developed a strange blind spot exactly the size and shape of Lucas's empire. But Lucas had learned a terrible lesson. Power without respect was vulnerability. He increased security around his family tenfold. He moved them to a new location, more fortified, more private. He never spoke publicly about the warehouse incident, but the legend grew in whispers. The night Frank Lucas went to war with the city's power structure and won. The white supremacist movement in New York went underground, terrified of provoking another response. Billy Ray, released from the hospital months later, left the city permanently, a broken man whose story served as a cautionary tale. The Heritage Corner Social Club closed its doors. The remaining members scattered, understanding that their ideology had painted targets on their backs. Harlem itself changed. The incident reinforced Lucas's position at the apex of the criminal hierarchy. Other gangs, other dealers, understood that Lucas operated under different rules now, rules enforced not just by his own power, but by the reluctant complicity of the very system supposed to oppose him. 3 months after the attack, Lucas sat in his new study, a room with bulletproof windows and reinforced walls. Juliana was upstairs, slowly recovering, speaking again, though she still flinched at unexpected sounds. His children were in private schools with security details disguised as drivers and tutors. He poured himself an expensive scotch and stared out at the Harlem skyline. He had won, but the victory tasted like ash. He had been forced to become the monster his enemies feared, to cross lines he had spent years carefully avoiding. The Blue Magic operation continued, more profitable than ever, but the purity of his earlier vision, the belief that he could be a successful criminal without becoming a violent one, had been shattered. The police had stepped aside, not because they respected him, but because they feared the truth he could reveal. The city's power structure had bent not to his strength, but to the threat of their own exposure. It was a hollow triumph, built on coercion and the systematic failure of institutions that should have protected his family in the first place. When the protectors become perpetrators, and the only recourse for justice is the violence of criminals, what truly is the value of the law? Lucas didn't have an answer. He only knew that he had defended his family the only way the city had left him, with overwhelming, uncompromising. The silence that now surrounded his operations wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a wound that would never fully heal, a permanent reminder that in the absence of justice, vengeance becomes its own terrible law. Frank Lucas took another sip of scotch and closed his eyes. The price of his family's safety had been paid in full, but the cost to his soul was incalculable. He had crossed the line from criminal to avenger, and there was no going back. The city had forced his hand, and now they would all live with the consequences of that forcing. In the distance, sirens wailed, a patrol car responding to some routine call, carefully avoiding the invisible boundaries that now marked Lucas's territory. The new order had been established. The price of peace was the systematic silence of the NYPD, and that silence would endure as long as Frank Lucas held the evidence that could destroy them all. This was the terrifying equilibrium: justice abandoned, vengeance triumphant, and a city that had learned to fear the very thing it had created.